Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. I think you'll understand why we've chosen to start at 10:15 this morning, because we're fortunate enough that Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health, is here. Matt, good morning. Thanks for joining us. And of course, Carolyn Fairburn, the Director General of the CBI. Matt, normally what we do in these calls is that Carolyn will give us sort of look at how business sees things. Actually, given what we've seen overnight and some of the concern about the infection rates and hospitalization rates, I thought actually it would be most useful if we could start with a sense from you of where you think we are, what you're seeing in the numbers, and how the NHS and the whole of health and social care is responding. And then I'll bring Carolyn in to learn a little bit more about how business is responding. So do you want to start there?
Well, thanks, James, and thanks very much for having me. The overall strategy is to suppress the virus while protecting the economy and education and the NHS until a vaccine can make us safe. And within that, our goal is as little national action as is necessary, and to take local action where that's required. And essentially, by firmer local action, we can negate the need as much as is possible for measures at a national level. And so, given that as context, the data in the last few days have shown a very sharp continued acceleration of cases across large parts of the northwest, Liverpool and Manchester in particular, the northeast, where we brought in measures last week, and thankfully across parts of the West Midlands the rates are high, and there is local action in place in parts of the West Midlands, but are not rising as sharply, and we are seeing some increase in London. So that's the overall picture. It's it is a challenge, and everybody will have seen it from the rising case rates and unfortunately the rising hospitalization rates, which have risen really quite sharply in the last week or so, that we have got a very serious problem on our hands. And the challenge is how to deal with this second peak in a way that it has as little damage as possible. Thankfully, we know far more about it than first time round.
And I'm sure, Matt, one of the things that's good about these calls that we found is a chance for people in business to hear from someone like you, hear from Carolyn too, what's happening in government thinking, but also for you to hear from businesses. So I'm going to make sure we hear from those people who are making points, asking questions. But can you just give us a little more granular detail on the infection rate and the hospitalization rate? I suppose, 2-3 weeks ago, when the Prime Minister was extending restrictions, there was a debate about infection rates increasing, but hospital rates still being very, very low, and the mortality rate being extremely low. Are you seeing an increase now that suggests hospitalization rates are about to start a very steep increase in the way in which the infection rate has done as well?
Yes, well, the challenge is that there's a lag from the number of infections to the number of people who enter hospital, to the number of people who sadly die. And so comparing today's case rate with today's hospitalization rate and the number of people who die is not the valid comparison, because there is an approximately 2 to 3 week lag from cases to hospitalizations, and then a similar lag from hospitalizations to the number of people who die. And so in a way, so the case rate is the earliest indicator, and you have to then the valid question is, to what extent are the numbers of cases passing through into morbidity and mortality, and to what extent is that similar to first time round? Now, there has been a very, as well noticed, and it's clear in the data, a sharp rise in the number of cases amongst younger adults, and that is they are the least likely to die out of the adult population. Actually, the number of cases amongst children has been very, very low throughout. But the problem is that there are parts of the country where the number of people who are over the age of 60 who are catching it is now rising quite sharply. And the number of cases amongst the over 60s translates very directly into those who end up those who end up in hospital.
Carolyn, do you want to, I hope we can really have a conversation here. Do you want to just give a sense of how you think, hearing from CBI members, how business is digesting what Matt describes as this second?
Yeah, so I've been in very close touch with members over the last few days, and Matt, terrific to have you with us, because I think this is obviously such a critical time on the health front, and that translates into a time of rising anxiety on the business front. And one of the things I would say is I really think we've had a good partnership over this first part of the pandemic. I mean, the fact that we have been able to work together with your government to create COVID secure workplaces, to be able to open up parts of our economy. And we did see that bounce back in July of 6.5%. And actually, I think that was a result of that partnership. But there is rising anxiety now, because I think that we are seeing clearly a strong second wave, but there are now big questions, I think, coming through from businesses about how this is handled. And if I can just sort of put a few of them on the table, I think one of them is around clarity. The fact that there are so many different kinds of lockdown situations across the country, and I think there's real understanding from the business side as to why we got there. You're trying to avoid a second lockdown. We want that as well. That's but can there be some kind of tiering system quickly that creates greater clarity for businesses and the public? And with that, crucially, support packages that come out at the same time for business, because they are so affected. I think the other thing that's coming over very strongly is where there are additional restrictions, can they be really evidence-based? Can you show your workings so that we can build the kind of confidence around them? And you might know that we've had quite a lot of concern around the 10 p.m. Curfew. And then clearly, finally, just around testing. I know, and actually we are, you have done, I think, a really amazing job to build testing capacity up so quickly, and we have been supporting Dido Harding in every way we can. But we are increasingly hearing from members who are unable to get their people tested quickly enough. They've got whole teams off work, the impact of schools going back on businesses having to close part of their operations is growing. And it would be great to understand how we might be able to get sort of business and workplace testing really up and running. And then a final point that is coming through loud and clear is, can we get people flying again on the aviation front? That has often been talked about as an issue around holidays. Actually, it's a vital enabler for our future economy. Other countries are managing to get aviation testing up and running. We are not, and it would be terrific to get your thoughts on that as well, Matt.
Well, I'm really grateful for what you said, Carolyn. As somebody who was in a small business before I came into politics, and in many ways it's because of those experiences when I was growing up in a family of entrepreneurs that led me into politics in the first place. I totally understand where you're coming from, and my first job in government was in the business department. I mean, I'm both personally before I went into politics and ministerially. This is my home, and I understand the pressures and the impact, and the actions that we take. We do so with enormous reluctance because of the wider impact. And I think to a large part, the business community has pulled together and played its part in trying to tackle the pandemic. It really is a national effort. On the specifics of the questions, there's of course, we try to do, take these steps with in as open and evidence-based and objective way as possible. Of course, there are judgments within that. Given that the science is that the closer you are together, the more you pass the disease, and the later at night it is, the more likely you are to not fully abide by social distancing. That leads to the sorts of policy interventions like the 10 p.m. restrictions that are not the sort of thing anybody would want to do, but they are ultimately judgments about trying to keep things open by suppressing the virus where we know that it transmits. On testing, obviously we've done this massive expansion of capacity. Incidentally, in parentheses, I'd say that one of the stories that that matters in this crisis is the capability of government and business to work together to make things happen has been unbelievable. And the testing program is one example of that. Of course, there's the NHS labs and the PHE labs, and they're very important, and we're expanding them. But you can't just do it on that side. You also need the private testing capacity and the diagnostics companies, especially the hitherto small to medium sized British diagnostics companies that have really stepped up to the plate and expanded. It's a big team effort. On access to testing, we've now got capacity of the taxpayer-funded testing of over 300,000 a day. Many of the problems from early September have now been sorted. For instance, the turnaround time has come down in the last few weeks, and the access has got much easier. In fact, I endlessly get text messages from people who gone on the website, got a test within a couple of hours, had the test result back either later that day or within or the next day, and the vast majority of people get a good service. The average distance traveled is now 4.3 miles, down from over 6 miles a couple of weeks ago. So this is a massive build. The test and trace program is now the scale of Tesco, and we've built it in 6 months. But having said all that, obviously we've got to keep pushing it and driving it and making it more and more accessible. We did publish 10 days or so ago a protocol for how businesses can. Yes, we saw that. Yeah. And I recommend it to you. There are many businesses who test their workforce, and I think that's unambiguously a good thing. That one of the earliest into this was AstraZeneca, who of course have got their own in-house testing capability, so it's easier. But this is it is part of the solution to have businesses testing, and that we published the protocol in order to try to make it that as straightforward as possible. And on the last thing you say, I think that I do think that the answer to getting through the next stage is to be as collaborative as possible. It is a more regionalized epidemic, the second wave, and so that is the approach that we're taking to try to minimize the action that's necessary to national level.
Matt, thank you. I'm going to pick up on a couple of things, and Carolyn, as you were talking, and as Matt was talking, there's some questions that have been coming in. Just a couple of follow-ups. I think lots of people appreciate the pressure the government's under in terms of rollout on testing and communicating that progress is really being made. But also there's the public's frustration that their problems with testing aren't necessarily getting through, and the government doesn't necessarily hear the problems they're facing, whether they're businesses or individuals. And so, Matt, will you just talk about what you see now as the priorities on the test and trace program, the things that you think most urgently need fixing?
Yeah, I also will answer the question about international travel that Carolyn asked that I get to. So I mean, in terms of priorities, number one is expanding the testing capacity. I mean, that's been my priority for months and months and months now. And, I've put my head on the block a couple of times by setting what I later discovered were big, hairy, audacious goals. Apparently, by setting, for instance, the 100,000 target for the end of April, I was told afterwards that I was following a standard management consultancy textbook to set a BHAG. Rishi said to me, "You've set a BHAG." I said, "What's a BHAG?" He said, "Oh, it's everybody who goes to business school knows what a BHAG is. It's a big, hairy, audacious goal, and you set it in order to make the system respond." It was like I was a bit like, I've been writing prose all my life and didn't know it. This is how you make things happen. And I took a load of criticism for setting a goal and then and driving towards it. And I don't accept any of that criticism. It needed to happen. So the first priority is, of course, the continued expansion on the current technology. We're on track to increase capacity to 500,000 by the end of this month. The next priority, in parallel with that, is, of course, to bring the new technologies to bear, new technologies that can get testing to the out into the field, so that the test doesn't have to come back through the lab, and tests where the lab turnaround is much greater. We're going to end up with a whole series of these different testing technologies for different uses, and it's a fast-moving field where these tests are currently in development and verification and trials in the field, and I hope we can continue to make progress on that. And then you can think about further use cases. We've published the prioritization of tests for the current generation of tests, and obviously that is about trying to keep the firstly clinical use and then trying to keep the economy open. For instance, I recognize what you say about schools, and as and when we can expand testing further, and where we have confidence, high degree of confidence, that the testing doesn't give you false comfort, because one of the most difficult thing about this virus is the fact it passes on asymptomatically, and that leads to a huge challenge of people incubating it without knowing it, and that is why the on-the-day testing, when you arrive, say, at an airport, doesn't work. And all the countries in the world, all the major countries in the world that have introduced that, have then moved to a form of quarantine and then test after a period of time. And that's a conversation that we're having actively with the travel industry.
Matt, can we just? I'm going to come back, because there are a couple of questions about travel. Let's just see if we can get to the end of testing. So we get to the ambition is 500,000 by the end of this month. Can you just talk through November, December, what the ambitions are, and then can you tell us a little bit about mass testing, how that's intended to operate between the NHS and social care, but also what the expectations of business might be in this?
Well, we haven't set out where we expect to get to on mass testing yet, because we've set out very clearly the direction of travel and the scale of the ambition, but we also so we're now in the period where we're reliant on the technology coming good, on the verification of that technology, which is happening at pace, firstly at Porton Down in the labs and then out in the field, because if you have a test that doesn't work effectively, then you give people false comfort, which is actively dangerous for the virus rather than reassuring. And so that's underway now. And last month we set out quite a lot of detail on it, and we'll update more on that as soon as is possible. But what I'd say more strategically is, there's no doubt that testing expansion is going to help us to manage this virus. But the first line of defense, until a vaccine arrives that can keep us safe, is the social distancing. It just is. That's just the nature of the virus, is it passes on from person to person.
So can we talk about that? And actually, Carolyn, it'd be, I think, good to compare notes on this. There are a number of people asking questions about lockdowns and restrictions. And I suppose just putting together the different questions, there are sort of three things that are coming up. One is the point that Carolyn made at the top about clarity of communication. Is there going to be a simplification so people know where they are? The second one is economic support linked to lockdown, right? So obviously, when the original furlough scheme came in place, it was easier for businesses to work out how they're going to get through that. It's not as clear with the job support scheme, and it's not as clear in terms of support in local and regionalised lockdowns. And then I suppose the third one is the is it enough question, the circuit breaker question, which seems to be, given the infection rates, getting greater currency.
Yeah. So let's start with the strategy, and then I'll work through those points. There are only two potential strategies. One is suppress the virus until a vaccine can keep us safe. And the other is let it rip. There are no alternatives, because you can't just let it go a little bit, because the nature of exponential growth, as we're seeing in parts of the country, is that unless it is under control, it goes up faster and faster, because which is what, you know, at the root of the R number, as an average of the number of people who any individual who has it passes the virus onto. And therefore, unless you're prepared to let it rip, and that would inevitably move outside of the younger age group, where it's at its biggest at the moment, and into those groups of people who have a much greater morbidity and mortality risk, then you have to act in order to suppress the virus. So I reject the let it rip strategy, because it would lead to a huge number of deaths that I think is far too high for us to be able to accept, even though there is clearly a significant impact of the measures that we have to bring in place. So then the question is how to bring it under control in a way that is least damaging to the economy and to education. And there we've provided that economic support in the past, and that is an important part of how we've dealt with it. When we took action in the Northeast last week, and then in Liverpool and parts of Teesside, we put in a support package for those for the councils, but we didn't close any businesses. So whilst there clearly is a business impact, and I get that, the furlough scheme still operates, and therefore the broader national support was available. But of course, there's an impact on the need for economic support. I get that. And then the point you make on clarity, I mean, we have brought more clarity in. I think the rule of 6 was a big step forward. It was very good news that last night the House of Commons passed the rule of 6 by 270. So although there are some people who argue against it, you can't argue against these measures without providing an alternative, unless you are just saying that we should let the virus rip. And I think that, so the Commons supported that with a very significant majority. And obviously we're looking to bring clarity wherever we can. In terms of the local action, we have, as much as possible, tried to design that with the local councils, who are the boots on the ground in the efforts to control the virus. And that's why you have ended up with slightly different measures in different parts of the country. I can see the argument for bringing clarity to that.
And Matt, so I'm going to come to Carolyn. One thing about the circuit breaker question.
Yeah. So then there's a question of how much you need to do, and that's a very difficult judgment, because you don't want to cause damage by doing too much, but you know.
No, I get that. But forgive me for interrupting. The reason I say it is that you see people on the call who are saying, look, can you give us some more advance notice? Because we're running businesses and we're trying to plan. And we appreciate, even if they buy your argument, which is we're not going to go the let it route, we're going to go social distance and suppress. Getting some advance notice is really helpful. And if we're headed towards circuit breaker, then it would be useful for people to know that's more likely than not.
I see. Yeah, the challenge of that is that, you know, with something that moves as fast as this does, you know, we have to act at sometimes at extraordinary speed, and far faster than a normal government operation would. And so I do understand that. So there's a very careful balance between acting fast in order to control the virus and giving people enough time to prepare. I understand that.
Carolyn, do you want to weigh in on this question of economic support? And I suppose one of the things that's, I know, Matt, you're thinking about the health issues here, but one of the recurrent questions here has been about horizontal support in the economy or sectoral support, regional support, and how that's coordinated at in government. Carolyn, do you want to sort of reflect on that?
Absolutely. And I actually just want to start with, Matt, this can feel like an interrogation this morning. I mean, I think that one of the things I just want to say is I actually think that the economic support sitting alongside the health support has been really outstanding for a lot of the period so far. And if I look at the JRS and the evolution we're going through, so a lot of this has already been a really good partnership. But I do think that as it is changing and becoming more focused, and what we're seeing now is some sectors actually doing quite well. You saw Tesco's results today, and other sectors really on their knees. And it's becoming very regionally well. There is just a change in tempo and a change in the challenge, and I think that's what we're really trying to get at with you today. And I've always been very impressed by how you've taken just a really business, sort of quite hard economic sort of approach alongside your health approach, and we really do appreciate that. I think that what we're hearing from members, and James has some of it, is the more clarity and visibility there can be, the more you will protect jobs. It's almost as simple as that, because what we're seeing, I think, is a really resilient business community in many ways. And I think that is a great strength. But what is really hard is where you have overnight changes in regulations and no financial support alongside it. And that is really flooring for a business. And we have seen that. We have seen quite a lot of that, and even in the early days, the economic packages came quite a long, a matter of days or weeks after the health packages. If we can move to them being synchronized, honestly, it would be a tremendous help. And that's why this idea of a tiering system with very clearly understood support packages would be really helpful. The world is going to feel very different in November because there'll be no job retention scheme. That is a total blanket lifeline. We have supported the evolution away from that. I've worked with the Chancellor very closely on that, but it's really different and it's not going to provide that same level of support. So I think anything that you can do alongside the Chancellor to create those combined packages, particularly for those sectors that have to close completely. I'm looking at, parts of exhibitions can't open, live events, hospitality is talked quite a lot about, but there is also, parts of manufacturing. That synchronization, and then I think we as a business community can protect as many jobs as we can.
Yeah, well, that is the team effort that we need, isn't it? And the focus is on protecting jobs through the crisis and then on the recovery afterwards. That is the that's got to be the goal. And when the PM talks about build back better, there is going to be, after this too will pass. We will come through, and then we will need a massive economic recovery that needs to actually learn from the things that have gone well, because underneath the huge challenges, some changes will never go back. In my area, telemedicine is the most obvious example, and whilst for many businesses this has been an incredibly difficult time, there are others who have who have really stepped up and because the response has required it. So there's I basically can totally see where you're coming from, and I think that engagement is important. We have now been through this a few times, and so we have there is more clarity about the sort of things that we need to do. For instance, we have far better information from the contact tracing now as to where the disease is most likely to spread, which means that we're able to protect far more of the economy than last time around, when we simply didn't have that understanding.
Can I come back on one thing to do with that, Matt? Because I agree with that. But what we're getting concerned about is some of those successful businesses that are creating jobs at the moment are being affected by the tracing system. So I said, they are having to close down shifts, or because they have got some people who may possibly have come into contact with somebody who's been identified. Completely understand why that is happening. But I go back to the point to this question about mass testing, which you answered, I think, very, very, very carefully about, it's all about, you have to have accuracy, they have to give all the right results. Can I challenge a little bit on the value of tests that are that give you some pretty good results? The Abbott test is an example. I understand it is a 2% or 3% false negative or positive. In the kind of industries that we're talking about, where actually it's so important to get shifts into work, they are going to be the job creators of the future. Will it not be possible to license tests like that, particularly if they are repeat testing, where if there was a false negative, then you pick that false negative up 2 days later, or whatever. So and do we have a risk-assessed approach to testing that can work for all different environments?
Yeah, so look, this is a really important point, and I don't want to give the impression that we are searching for perfection. What we're searching for is the right test that can be used in the right circumstances. Because if you're going to add testing to something that's happening already, then that undoubtedly protects people. The harder question is what more things we can do when you have testing in place. And also, I'd also slightly separate out the distinction between the rate of false positive and the rate of false negative. Because if you have a lot of false positives, that is actively unhelpful to you running your business, because you end up with a lot of people self-isolating and their contacts having to self-isolate.
So they can go get a test. They can then go get a lab test.
Absolutely. So double testing.
That's the way around that.
Absolutely a way through it. Yeah.
Matt, can I pick up also on a couple of things you said? One is, you'll have seen their businessmen, you'll have noticed someone like Hugh Osmond, the pub operator, who gets very irritated by, frankly, a good deal the government's doing, but in particular not feeling as though there are business people alongside government when they're making decisions, so that some of the more granular issues that come up when restrictions are imposed are not considered. And I just wondered, when you reflect on the geographical differences in infection rates and what you're learning from test and trace about where infections are happening, whether or not that's having an impact on which businesses need to close and which ones need to stay open.
Yeah, I mean, we absolutely have learned from that sort of data. There's no doubt about it. And what I'd say is that, unfortunately for some businesses, that leads to the conclusion that there are certain places where transmission is higher, and that's true in terms of mortality. And I saw that we published a huge amount of stats on this, and there's a figure that was being used, a very low figure of the proportion of outbreaks that are from in hospitality, but that is the wrong measure, because outbreaks are where you have an institution that has contacted PHE because they have a problem within that institution, typically a school or a care home, and also when there's a particular outbreak in a business, like we've seen in some of the some of the food factories, for instance, which have been dealt with in the very large part really very, very well and very responsibly. I shout out to Glencore, who did a very, very good job of controlling the outbreak in Norfolk a few weeks ago. That is different from the contact tracing data that asks people what contacts they had, and that's where you find what proportion of people are likely to have caught it in what settings, and that's what leads to the indications that partly because I'm sure of COVID secure work that you touched on right at the start, Carolyn, there is a relatively low proportion of people who are likely to have caught it in the workplace, and the outside your household or socializing between other households, the highest place of incidence of likely transmission measured by where people have contacts is unfortunately hospitality. Now, obviously, that finding is not good news in terms of the policy action we have to take for that sector. I get that, and I feel it. I mean, I know what it feels like to be in a business where you're hit by something completely outside your control, which can knock you over. I mean, that's one of the things that got me into politics in the first place, was the sense of, you've heard this story before, Carolyn, that, the reason that I got interested in how the whole system works is because my family business got almost knocked out by a cash flow problem because of a late payment issue. Yes. And that's exactly the sort of, so I understand why something completely outside your control is then causing a huge problem to your business, and it pains me, and it pains, I know that Rishi feels the same, and he comes from an NHS family, so both of us see it from the other's point of view when you're thinking about the health and the economic impacts of this. The challenge is that we do have to suppress the virus, because it would be a worse outcome for everybody if it got out of control again and led to the consequences that would inevitably bring.
Matt, in the last 5 minutes, can you just help us look up and over the near horizon?
Yeah.
In particular, I suppose we're just trying to think through, and I think lots of businesses are asking, right, is it just sort of hunker down for the next 6 months and hope for the best in 2021? Or when you look at things, and I'm thinking around therapies, mass testing, vaccine rollout, do you think things begin to look very different in the first quarter of 2021, and if so, how?
I have hope. I have hope. Nobody has certainty. No vaccine is. We can be confident of no vaccine until it can be safely passed by the regulators and licensed. The combination, though, of treatments which have reduced the mortality, although not by enough yet, of a testing expansion so that we can understand even more where the virus is, and then should a vaccine come through, 2021 starts to look very different. And the Prime Minister said that what he did about Conservative Party conference next year, where we shall be back together again face to face. And I think that I think we can. I think the way I hope that we have got to. We've got a finite period that we've got to get through and suppress this. We are then clearly going to have to manage the disease, but the technology and the tools at our disposal will be much greater. So I have real hope for recovery from 2021 onwards.
You said at the top, Matt, sorry, you said at the top that we know much more about the disease than we did in March. Do you expect that the mortality rate will be lower in this second wave than it was in the first?
Yes, to a degree, but not enough to mean that we can just let it rip.
Right.
So we know from dexamethasone that has around a 30% reduction in mortality for the most clinically ill. and there have been improvements to clinical methods in terms of early oxygenation and late intubation that have also improved mortality rates. But still, the consequences of this going through the whole population before we have a vaccine are really very terrible.
There was, just in the last couple of minutes, Carolyn, if I might, I'll come to you. There was in the very, very early phase of this, I think everyone will agree, there was probably a more cohesive response in the sense that people thought this is a hell of a shock, but we're going to try and pull together.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was striking was businesses saying, okay, how do we help on PHE? Sorry, on PPE? How do we help support the NHS and social care? I don't know, Carolyn, whether you wanted to have any thoughts on what businesses can or should do now in this second wave, and whether, Matt, you've got thoughts on what you'd like to see businesses do to help contribute.
I mean, I'd love to hear Matt, so I'll answer that question. But I'd say I share Matt's optimism about the future, because I think what we have seen is this extraordinary power of collaboration between business and government. And you're right, James, ventilators, PPE, testing, and now vaccines. It is actually quite moving, I think, to see what you can do when you have a real partnership. And what I would like to say is that let's keep that partnership going. Let's keep it really, really close, both on those big innovations that we need, but also in how we manage our way through this. Because actually, I think we're all trying to achieve the same thing. And I think it's been incredibly encouraging to see what we've been able to do together. And I think this phase is harder. This phase does feel harder. It feels as though it's got more fragmented. The judgments have become more difficult. And Matt, I would just like to offer you all support we can from the CBI and our members going through this next stage. And we'd actually love to hear your answer to James's question, what more we can do to help you to get to the right place over the next few weeks and months.
Well, it's a great question. We have seen these enormous national efforts, and you listed the main ones. And by the end of this year, our goal is that on all PPE lines but one, 70% is going to be domestically manufactured. I mean, that's an incredible change from essentially almost nothing. And obviously on testing, we've essentially built a UK diagnostics industry that had a few brilliant but small players, and we've built that in record order. And so the first direct thing that businesses can do is keep innovating, because it's technology that
absolutely
to get it.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned the link between business and government, we've got to bring the scientists into that as well, because British science has done brilliantly through this. But then there's something that every business can help with, which is we put these rules in place because we think they're required, not because we like to. And COVID secure businesses are not only helping themselves and their staff and their customers, but they're helping the country. And taking seriously the various measures that we've brought in, the customer logs, the QR codes. We talked about those before we brought policy. Making sure that everybody steps up to the mark and does their bit. Applies right across the board. It is harder than first time round, but I think that the vast majority of the public, given the two strategic choices, the vast majority of people agree with the strategy, which is we've got to suppress this until a vaccine arrives. And it's from that strategy that all of the other actions flow, and that is, and I think I'm absolutely convinced it's the right strategic choice. And then we've just got to try to get the implementation of that the best we possibly can in what are very challenging and often fast-moving circumstances. And this is something that so many people in business understand.
Matt, thank you so much. Carolyn, thank you. We really appreciate more than anything your time this morning. We know how much, I don't think we probably do know how much, but we get a vague sense of quite how much is on your plate. So thank you very much. We hold these sessions every Monday and Wednesday. Next Monday, in fact, we're devoting the whole day to an international trade conference, so we won't be back for CBI at 10 on Monday, but back on Wednesday. But for this morning, a big thank you to you, Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, as ever, Carolyn Fairburn, Director General of the CBI. Thank you very much indeed, and have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.